So we'll be talking about iOS in how to approach the topic, how to think about the topic from the beginning. Maciek? Yes, we have just. So we'll talk about a few aspects of this iOS. On one side, what's happening on the market. We'll talk about what's changing on the market. We'll have two case studies around how to approach iOS on the Google side, and not only that. Yeah. So on that side, if we start from the beginning, it's in the last If we start from the beginning, why iOS matters? Of course, if we look at the popularity, especially in our region, most of the countries are very Android-driven. So if we look at the stat counter, but of course there are a few countries that are very iOS-driven, like for example, even by the number of downloads, like Sweden, or for example, US, or some, for example, Australia. Of course, the same is both for gaming and non-gaming. Very often in non-gaming, even the share of this iOS downloads is even higher. But then, of course, what is happening is that the countries, there are some countries where the share of downloads, even by the downloads, is actually very high on the iOS side. For example, again, US, UK, Sweden. In general, the whole Scandinavia is very strong on iOS. Even Germany, even actually in our region, the iOS is getting more and more important. Especially if we look and start to compare the revenue downloads, the revenue per download. That's actually, I look at a few categories based on Sensor Tower /Data AI, comparing what is the revenue per download, comparing iOS versus Android, based on very recent data, last 12 months. Just looking at the US, because that's the market everyone cares about. But it's actually, I think, giving pretty good info, what's happening here. So we see that very often this revenue per downloads is actually even much higher on the non-gaming side. So for example, let's see subscriptions or IOPs as the way to even get additional revenue. It became very popular in gaming. In non-gaming, slowly that type of monetization is adopting, but especially on the iOS side. Yeah? So if we look at the iOS applications, way more of them are monetized by subscriptions or IIPs or both, versus on the Android side. So that's where you see this revenue per download is much higher. But even if you look at average, let's see the average would be 80%, even in this US, on the application side, by average revenue per download on app side is 80% higher on iOS than on Android. If we actually look at the gaming as overall, it's actually kind of similar. You see that overall, with some differences between the genres, but overall this revenue per download on iOS is around 80–90% higher on iOS versus Android, both on the non-gaming and gaming sides. Of course, there are some genres that are very on iOS heavy, in this case we have action games, for example, or we have, of course, much higher share of those business apps that are very well monetizing on iOS, but in general that is the case. What we see it's happening is even based on just even deeper data. That's actually very recent but very interesting data that was done by Statista on many markets, where they were comparing what is the share of users with the high income, overall in the populations, in the internet users versus the iOS users. Yeah, and we see that in most of the, in almost all countries, there was very high overrepresentation of the high income users in the iOS versus Android. It was especially visible in those very emerging markets, for example, India, Brazil. The more emerging market, the more iOS users was defining high-value user. Yeah? So in general, we see that, for example, the differences between those tier 1 markets versus under iOS are smaller. But if you compare with the those emerging markets, the differences was much higher. Probably the only region where not necessarily iOS means very high value users, actually Japan and South Korea, where a lot of very high quality Android devices exist, and not necessarily iOS means high value users. But still, if we look at the data, if we look at the very recent data, we see actually a lot of markets growing very heavily on iOS. That's the Dimitri started to look at the data. I went a little bit deeper. So in this case, we have, for example, like gaming, when we have 3 variables. What is the growth rate in downloads? What is the growth rate in revenue? So first 5 months of this year versus the first 5 months of the 2023. And we see that even actually a lot of countries, especially from like a lot of countries are really in that good position where actually the country still is growing both in the downloads and revenue year over year, where of course size of the bubble is just the size of the revenue in iOS. So we see that's how US is actually very heavy on like in iOS, but on the other side, iOS had very strong growth on iOS in the last month, but now it's getting kind of almost flat. With still pretty nice revenue growth. You see it's almost like 20% year over year, but with, of course, higher and higher fight for the user. Yeah? So let's see the downloads are almost flat with higher revenue monetization, which means that, of course, we can expect much higher fight for the CPI and for the user in those markets. Yeah? So we can expect that CPI will be rising in US on iOS because, again, the revenue is growing much faster than downloads. So that's why I think I'm expecting that more and more actually companies will try to diversify the user acquisition among the smaller markets, because they see there are like a lot of still markets that are growing really nicely, both on the they have the growth in the download sides, not only on the revenue side. If we look at the non-gaming, it's actually, that story is even more interesting. So we see that overall this growth is even higher. You see almost all countries are on that field that have both positive revenue growth and download growth. So we see that on the non-gaming, the growth is actually really growing. Still, of course, the size of the bubble is revenue, which means that still it's actually US heavy, but we see more and more countries that actually have some substantial numbers. Like even Poland, for example, if you look at the iOS, it has like 20% growth in the year-over-year growth, and like almost 20% in terms of the downloads growth. Yeah, so it's still like Poland on iOS is the market that's growing 20% year-over-year in terms of downloads and revenue, which means that there are a lot of markets that actually are getting really interesting on iOS side. If we change the dimension, because that was mostly around revenue, which was more like the number for the people who are optimizing towards like purchases or like in-apps and subscriptions. But even if you change if we change the dimension, and we, in this case, the size of the bubble will be like the number of the downloads. So in this case, we look at the perspective, okay, which countries are getting important for those markets and for those companies that are more focusing on ad revenue, for example, because then usually the download is better predictor of the ad revenue than just IIP revenue. So we see actually, a lot of companies, actually a lot of countries, even the emerging ones, they're not maybe growing in terms of revenue, but they actually are really getting important and visible in terms of the downloads. Yeah. So on the iOS side, still, like for example, you see even countries like Colombia, like Indonesia, Turkey, Vietnam, they are really getting substantial. Of course, revenue, it's not really huge there, but again, if someone is more like focusing on the ad revenue, then that is getting quite interesting topic. Of course, in this case, we can ask, okay, why in this case Google makes sense to think about in terms of user acquisition? Of course, for a few different reasons, like even if you look at, okay, from Google App Campaigns, you can like try to reach the users, and all Google properties like try to reach the user at search, at YouTube, and display network and AdMob. It's very easily to see, like for example, like if you look at the data, like even very recent ones based on the May, like in almost all countries, Google is like 98, 97% of the market share in search. Yeah, so that's why it makes sense to use Google even for iOS downloads, because users are there. Yeah, if we ask and we say that, for example, a lot of users, like big part of the iOS campaigns or Google is, for example, YouTube app, then again, that's the data around like in which countries, like just by the example, like YouTube app is number one app by the number of active users. Yes, almost all countries, the YouTube app is number one by number of active users overall, like bigger than Facebook, bigger than Instagram. Just in a few markets, WhatsApp is, for example, bigger. But it's still in many countries, it's really growing. So that's why I think like there's of course competition around which traffic source will be used to get the user, but I think there is still a lot of reasons why actually to really try out Google for user acquisitions on iOS. But then of course there comes the question how to approach iOS with Google, and there is like a lot of different methodologies and different approaches to measure iOS performance. I was speaking about that a little bit in the few last GameCamp slides, so I will not do it again because it would be boring for some people. But the people who really want to go really deep in terms of in which circumstances Google iOS campaigns can work, which cannot, maybe 4 weeks ago, I was doing quite extensive webinar about the topic. It's actually quite almost 1 hour of content going very deep in terms of how these iOS campaigns on Google work, what are the potential problems, what are potential challenges. So I thought that it makes rather sense to really show that link. You can really look at that separately. And then on the other hand, I thought it makes easier even to listen to the next presentations where, for example, Andrea and Joy will be talking about how they working with Google campaigns. So from the first hand, you could hear about more what is easy, what is hard. But of course, from the development perspective, what is happening on the Google side, all different new solutions coming around iOS are mostly solving those two main problems that we hear, of course, from Google advertisers. The first one is, my campaigns are not scaling. Or the second one is, I don't really know what is the right data when I look at Google campaigns. Of course, the second one is not just related only to Google, like every other company providing traffic has the same challenge, but of course, with different ways to approach it. So if we start from the first one, what we see now, what is happening is that on one side, there is more and more innovation on the Google side trying to adopt scan and trying to adjust to actually scan changes, how to really actually adjust the product and in general Google app campaigns to use the iOS side. And on the other side, how to actually make sure that if someone has first-party data, for example, coming from registration, coming from any activities, he can actually adopt the data to improve the modeling on the Google app campaigns. So that's why actually there was we see that on one side there are stuff happening here, but on the other side, how to actually make sure that if you have based on the users, you can add it to the campaign and then that data is used heavily. So if we go deeper, what's happening around those campaign measurement and campaign performance. So we see just recently we had quite a few changes happening around campaigns to actually add more functionalities around Scan 4, Scan 4.0, how to really, for example, add actually solutions for some problems. For example, let's see if we know that a lot of conversions in Google app campaigns coming from search, because search is actually important part of Google campaigns. Then, for example, Scan 3.0 does not support that, yeah? So if you look at the scan data, Scan 3.0, you don't have conversions coming from the users who, for example, search something on Google, and then they saw the ad for the specific app, and then they converted, yeah? So that is going to be partially supported, for example, by Scan 4.0. So that's what partially was launched in the end of the year. Then, of course, we have some additional activities related to this web to app, how to actually make sure that user can be recognized, that can be, once converts, we can understand who is coming from. And then we have some additional challenges related to the bidding. So for example, like, how to improve TROS solutions around iOS that are still not very heavily used, but how actually make it working for broader set of users, how to even create some bidding solutions based on the scan. Because of course, by definition, so far, most of the Google TROS solutions, actually all TROS solutions are based on the Firebase SDK bidding. So when the Firebase SDK getting the data and using for the bidding, but then how to actually use the scan data for the bidding as well. So if we look at the kind of user journey that we see over like companies starting to do the UA activities with Google on iOS, we see kind of following journey. So the first one is kind of, okay, someone starts, do the basic like scan schema, how it's like, what are like the main events before the conversion, like regular stuff that you do for any other traffic source, just to have the basic understanding of the campaigns. Then once you start to add some more sophisticated bidding, like for example, TCPA, like bidding for conversions or bidding for TROAS. Then we have some additional bidding functionalities and bidding optimizations here. But then what is happening is that, of course, what we then kind of trying to encouraging clients to is actually, okay, once you have this base, then you start to focus on your ATT rates. So there was like guys from Upslide, they were talking about these ATT rates, and that's a very, very crucial point because even on the Google side, a lot of bidding, a lot of stuff around model is actually based on the modeling. So it's based on the users who are giving the consent and giving that Google can know, okay, what is the traffic, what is the source, what is the conversion, yeah? So the more people are giving the right to use the data, the more our users, the higher the consent rate for the app, the better optimization of that campaign for that app on the Google site as well. So that's why, for example, if what we see is that very often, if for some advertiser the Google app campaigns are not working very well, one of the first reasons usually that, for example, app either doesn't have consent at all, or it has very low consent rate, for example. Yeah, because there is very little data that Google can really model on the final results. Then we can add additional stuff like this kind of new solution that was implemented by Google and added, it's called on-device measurement, which is exactly once you have the data, once you have the first-party data, you automatically add it to the campaigns, so then the data is actually used for the modeling. The people who you know, and the data is actually used to modify and optimize the modeling for the final activation. And then the last point is actually, so we see, for example, in this case, on one side we have this Google input, but on the other side, once you have your own data, you can add it to the modeling, so then the data will be better. And I think the next presentation will even contain more information about the topic. And then the last one is actually, of course, there are some new solutions on the Google side. For example, one that is called scan event integration, which is exactly kind of new way to bid based on the scan. But again, it kind of still requires quite a lot of data to make it working really well. Okay, and then we have the second topic, which is, okay, I can define the source of truth, which is again coming from the point that finally you can look at the performance by 3 different ways. So either you can look at the performance looking just by the people who just gave the consent. So let's see, 20% of the people are giving consent in the app. So the conversion rates, or like all the conversion data is just based on this 20%, yeah? Of course, the problem with that case is that for Google doesn't work, because in general, Google does not send the consent on its own products. Because to make it work, you would need to have the consent on two apps. On the app that is displaying the ad, and on the app where the app is displayed. Because in this case, even if you see, for example, the ad of the like someone's ads on the YouTube does not provide the consent. So then, in general, for app campaigns, this kind of system doesn't work at all. Then the second one is, of course, using the scan, which I think is getting wider and wider way to measure the data, and for all traffic sources in more like equal lay. Again, so far, still the challenge is that in Scan 3.0, it does not include the web-to-app approaches, which is, again, if we see that a lot of users in Google App campaigns can come seeing that ad in the search. So, for example, they see that ad in the search, they click it, and then they convert. The Scan 3.0 still doesn't include the data, because the Scan 3.0 does not have the support for web-to-app. But it's partially, it will be partially resolved in Scan 4.0, so that's why at least Scan 4.0 actually should really move forward quite heavily the scan measurement for the Google App campaigns. And then the last point, which is of course like Google modeling, when you are using just like the Google model data, but of course it's more like self-attribute data, so then not everyone likes to look just at that type of data. And of course it brings a lot of challenges. So for example, let's see if we have this first model, this based on the ATT. We know that, for example, it does not work for YouTube, because YouTube does not provide the consent, so it cannot really measure the data. It doesn't work for search, so that's why, again, this way, just looking at the data by the people who just give the consent doesn't work very well for Google. SCAD network, it brings a little bit more visibility to the data, but especially in the Scan 4.0, because again, as I was mentioning, Scan 3.0 does not support still web-to-app, which means that finally does not include if you look at the scan data for your app campaigns, it does not include the people who started some search in Google and then converted in your app. So of course, in this case, you can expect a lot of discrepancy between like different source of the data, between, for example, scan and some Google data coming from like conversion window, redownload definitions. So some, for example, like even if you look, for example, like compare Google data versus AppsFlyer data, yeah. For example, like sometimes there is like just different definition for the download. Web-to-app again, still. The web-to-app measurement on Safari, it will not be supported even in 4.0. Some older versions of something that was just added very recently to those famous campaign, those reports that you can do in your app campaigns to show attribution for your iOS campaigns. Just recently, there was a few additional kind of placement reports where you could see, for example, okay, what was the source of the what was the type of the source of the conversion for your iOS campaigns, either, for example, mobile applications or mobile web, and then even from which specific placement came. Still, some problems, for example, for the Google App campaigns, even the scam, come, for example, from the case that, for example, in Scan, Google.com and Google CO UK are different placements. So that's why, for example, if I'm in UK and sometimes I'm searching in google.com and sometimes I'm searching in Google SEO UK, it's different placement, which means that those privacy thresholds for iOS campaigns are measured separately for those two placements. Again, small detail, but actually makes a lot of implications for the iOS scan measurement. And then, of course, whatever kind of campaign we have, it's good to look at okay, what kind of traffic is coming from. For example, if it's the Google App campaign, where the traffic is coming from. It's coming from Google Search, Search Partners, Google Display Network, YouTube, because again, as I was mentioning, all those properties, depending on where the traffic is coming from, not necessarily are utilized and shown in the same way in scan. Then, of course, scale matters. Like, the higher the scale of the campaign, the more data, and so the smaller problems coming from the quality thresholds. And then, of course, what is happening as well, and that's actually, I think, quite important point, is that I think on Android, in general, on the Google side, like if you are running Google activities, Google App campaigns on Android, everyone got used to very precise bidding and targeting. So that's why, for example, if you look at that's exactly like example of a few kind of categories. For example, RPG, yeah? You see how big part of the campaigns on Google on Android with RPG games are going with TROAS. Like almost everyone is just measuring the value of the users, because in that category you are bidding on whales. So you actually want to even bid even a lot for the user who has potential high value. But of course, on iOS, such solutions actually much harder to do, because you would need you have access to much smaller number of data. You would need to have much bigger campaigns as well. And then there is much higher problem with those privacy thresholds. Then we see that, for example, most of those campaigns are based on the action. Not TROAS campaigns, but TCPA campaigns. And the same, for example, in shopping, we see that it actually should be, for example, like in similar case, for example, like in finance or in casino. Again, in casino, like I choose like Netherlands because it's a small country that is like important for many people. It's just kind of ceteris paribus. That's why I have chosen Netherlands. Yeah, but it's just example. Yes. So again, for example, casino, you see that most of the bidding on Android is on TROAS, but on iOS is actually kind of less advanced bidding strategy, because you don't have enough data to bid so sophisticatedly, in so sophisticated way. Yeah, exactly the same way in for example, in finance. Yeah, so we see that most of the bidding in finance vertical in Netherlands is focused on action campaigns, like when you are, for example, bidding per first deposit, or you're bidding first specific transaction. But again, on iOS, it's much harder, because you have much less data available, so you need to have much bigger budgets to scale such campaigns. So then you have kind of less advanced bidding type use. In this case, we see much higher share of, for example, users coming from install campaigns. Again, it's small detail, but quite important in general in the scaling campaigns, because what I see quite often is that, for example, someone is coming and is saying, okay, I would like to create a action-based campaign on iOS, because he's doing such campaigns on Android. He does not understand that on iOS, on Google, but in all types of campaigns, such campaign just requires higher budget and it just requires more data. Why? Because you have much less data visible to the system, much more privacy restrictions, which means that finally the pool for the system needs to be bigger to actually make it working. So that's why, for example, in many verticals, when you have, for example, action campaigns as the main bidding solution on Android, for example, you have install campaigns on iOS. Okay, that's what else? Just a few points that I think are quite important. Not many people know that there is some additional solution called Google App Reporting Pack. It's kind of additional solution that has set a lot of advanced reports, especially around creatives. We are talking about that at even last GameCamp event, but what is interesting, that new version of it, it has a lot of additional good reports for iOS campaigns. So those types of those reports that are not included into traditional traditional app interface. So again, whoever works with bigger app campaigns on iOS side on Google, I really encourage you to try it out because it's actually quite good stuff. It's available on GitHub because it's kind of solution that is unofficially supported by Google. It's not official Google solution, so it's kind of a little bit of the radar. It has quite a lot of additional reports around scan, around iOS optimization. So again, whoever is doing bigger UA campaigns on iOS on Google, I really recommend it to try it out. You could just scan that code to get there. There in that report, there is even some example report, like demo account that you can use. Just small detail, if you want to use it, you need to join such kind of group in the groups, Google Groups. Once you join that group, then you get access to that report again. I know it's a little bit deep, but I think it should be quite interesting for the people who want to go a bit deeper into those kind of bigger UA campaigns with Google. Okay, that would be all from my side. Just to remind, it really pays off to put attention towards iOS because it's actually a really growing market. Google has really good reach on that, and there are like a lot of ways you can use Google to actually reach all those users. Of course, put a lot of attention to the schema and to those best practices that are really around Google UA campaigns. But I think the best people who will actually share their story around how they work with those campaigns would be our next speakers.